Well, thanks everyone for joining us here today. We're joined by Ambassador Samantha Power. Now, Samantha has many roles and titles. Perhaps the coolest of them was given to her by former US President Barack Obama, who calls her one of our foremost thinkers on foreign policy. She's currently a professor at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. But before that, her job was ambassador from the United States to the United Nations. She's a former foreign affairs advisor to President Obama, and then before that, Senator Obama. And before that, she wrote a Pulitzer Prize winning book, A Problem from Hell. But her most recent book, The Education of an Idealist, and here it is a bestseller, deservedly so. Samantha, thank you so very much for joining us.
I'm so happy to be here.
Look, firstly, how are you going during this COVID period? It's a weird moment in history, and for all of us individually. How are you holding up?
Thank you so much for asking. We are a post-COVID household in the sense that we were struck early in the pandemic, and it was intense but short for me, and intense and long for my beloved husband. So we feel very lucky, very alert to what other families are going through. My mother is a 76-year-old physician in New York City, so I also confess some relief that the crisis has ebbed, at least for the time being, in New York, where she was on the front line, just in seeing patients and being in a difficult environment. But the main sort of feeling I have now is just as a heartbroken citizen watching this thing tear through communities that really could have been very well prepared for the onset, and instead this got caught up in something that seems to be ensnaring most issues these days, which is American polarization. So it's crushing to see a country with the capabilities and the talents, and particularly the scientific expertise of the US, leading the world in deaths and infections and in divisions over something that should be like the Martian that unites us from outer space. But sadly, it hasn't had that effect yet.
And I'm assuming you guys are still sort of largely in isolation in Massachusetts there?
We are, but definitely we're moving. Like, I think we're in phase 2, about to enter phase 3. So restaurants now have started seeing people indoors. Summer camps, I confess, selfishly, the main dimension of reopening that I was looking at was not where we'd be dining, but whether I would ever get my work back, because my kids would be occupied sometime during the day by someone other than me. And so summer camps, those that are outdoors for tennis and golf and things like that, are happening. But there's a lot of uncertainty about the fall, about September, and whether the kids will be going back to school. And that, of course, affects women, I think, disproportionately, but parents a lot, as they think through also their professional, the sort of balancing act that they strike. So you still feel that cloud of great uncertainty, as I know you must feel in Australia as well, even though you've handled it much better than we have. And I think just that's always been the hardest part. Even when my son, who's 11, was learning remotely, it was just the sweetest thing. Every day he'd say to the teacher, and when do you think we'll be back on campus? When will we be back at school? And for kids to adjust to the fact that parents have no idea is itself a kind of seminal feature of this, that none of the authorities know anything. And there's a lot of anger in certain parts of the country, like this one, that has done a good job, kind of getting it under control after having some real challenges in the early weeks. And now knowing that all those, job stay-at-homes and workplace closings haven't really put us in much of a stronger position because of the disparate implementation of the guidance that we were given. And so there's a lot of people, didn't go to work, stayed home, did the right thing, and now it's likely to come back, by virtue of the fact that we were not all singing from the same hymn book nationally.
Yeah. And I mean, so just on that, for some of our readers or viewers who might not be quite so up to speed on what's going on in the United States, it's been it's been the sort of case study of what not to do in a pandemic. I saw just on Twitter this morning, 6,000 people in Texas alone yesterday were hospitalized. And that's not even the worst state by a long shot from the looks of it. Now, I want to ask you specifically about the COVID response. And again, for anyone that hasn't read it, you've got real firsthand experience in dealing with pandemics and viral outbreaks through the Ebola crisis when you were at the UN. Talk us through what you think the Trump administration and Donald Trump himself could have been doing better and differently to get on top of this crisis.
I think the biggest challenge with the question, and it's a perfect question, but is everything I answer would require Donald Trump to be someone other than who he is. And really, and I mean that, I don't at all mean to be even political or snarky, but, you know, the temptation is to say, okay, from December 30th on forward, what were the moves on the chessboard that he could have made? What were the stockpiles he could have procured? You know, what were the travel shutdowns that he might have put in place, akin to those put in place by New Zealand and Australia? You know, at what juncture? We can do that, and maybe I'll say a word about those kind of tactical moves. But the first order challenge is that this is a pandemic that tests features of any leader that Donald Trump lacks. You know, in not because I, a critic of Donald Trump, says he lacks them, but he boasts about lacking them, right? He has contempt for science, contempt for expertise, grave mistrust of what he calls the deep state, what I would call the bureaucracy, which harbors an awful lot of expertise. And he thinks international institutions are out to rip off Americans and not out to advance their interests or their security. And that itself, that last prong, is rooted in a belief that our fates, or at least his fate, which seems first and foremost at all times, but that our fates are not linked to the fates of people living elsewhere. That they're, you know, it's the wall mentality, but here the form that it takes is, you know, that we can get away with sort of trying to deal with this, and again, without respecting science, expertise, or anything any other country has to offer us, but that we can get away with looking at this within the four corners of the United States. Whereas in fact, you know, even if we got it right in this country, which we're leading the world and getting it wrong, but even if we'd gotten it right, it would still matter what happens in countries that Donald Trump doesn't want to think about. It would still matter what's happening even in Rohingya refugee camps in Bangladesh, because our supply chains extend into Bangladesh. It would matter what happened in what Donald Trump calls S-hole countries in sub-Saharan Africa, because we have family ties with those places. You know, you can yell at China all you want and blame them for their horrible cover-up of this, and maybe we'll come, I'm sure, to discussion of China, but the fact of the matter is that our global supply chains extend into China. Our trade ties are inextricable at the moment on so many fronts to what is happening inside China. So we are connected. That ship has sailed, and there will be some decoupling or uncoupling, whatever the term is of the day, in the wake of this. But our ability as America, even if Trump could get the public health dimension of this right, which he can't, but our ability to resume economic normalcy turns on what's happening in other parts of the world, which is why instead of pulling out of the World Health Organization, it would have been a great idea to actually catalyze coalitions that could help those countries that don't have the wherewithal or the infrastructure, you know, to tackle something that is now walloping them in their close quarters. So I raise these structural kind of predispositions of Trump, because once you start right with that set of you know, tendencies or dispositions, your ability to make the right move when you hear about the first cases in Wuhan, you know, that there's only so much you're going to do. You've already driven out so many of the top scientists in your government. You've already cut the budget of CDC. You've already gotten rid of your pandemic office, which would have brought all the agencies of the U.S. government together. So it's pretty tough to overcome who you are. In fact, what a crisis does is it just puts on steroids and on display who you are, and that's the tragedy for so many American families right now.
Just on the question of the international organisations that you spoke of, and certainly you didn't mention the United Nations, but certainly United Nations are part of this. One of our viewers, Misha Zelinsky, was asking if we think, and I should point out, Misha is one of my board directors, hence he gets the first shout out. I should ask, post-COVID, post-Trump, be it in 6 months, 12 months, whatever it is, or 5 more years, will these international institutions be able to be rebuilt, or has Trump done sort of irreparable harm to them?
So I start, when I think about international institutions, thinking about them, at least in the first instance, as large buildings, usually not designed by the greatest of architects, although sometimes there are some exceptions, but just large buildings.
The best intentioned architects, surely.
Maybe, but they're not winning points for their buildingness, let's say. But I mentioned the sort of building dimension of it, because what international institutions are at the present and what they will become in the future will turn on what the people who enter those buildings decide to do with them. And so the questioner is absolutely right that international institutions are reeling because of the US retreat. They're also reeling because they made some bad tactical calls. I think that's fair to say, and that there's been recriminations out of that, and a desire for accountability at the WHO particularly. But if you compare those moves, made by an international civil servant in Geneva to what Donald Trump has done in this pandemic in cutting off funding to the WHO and in flattering Chinese officials far more than any international civil servant ever did, in terms of who's made international institutions work for better or worse, or who's sought to optimize performance, there's every individual involved in pandemic response should be asking themselves, what more could I have done? What could I have done sooner? That's very reasonable. And I was very appreciative, actually, of Australia's effort to secure a retrospective investigation of WHO's role. I think that's absolutely warranted by the facts. But, WHO would have acted very, very differently in late December and early January, probably if the Trump administration had filled its executive board seat. If there had been within these buildings, which are kind of like rugby scrums where different countries are pushing their agendas, and, to some extent, international civil servants are kind of, in the middle of it and trying to, make sense of things. If I'm the WHO, my number one objective is to get access to China. China's blocking access. When I look back, WHO, Tedros, they should have been more outspoken. They should have been criticizing China for blocking access instead of just this other approach, which was kind of diplomatic flattery and trying to get in the nice way through the front door. They would have been much more inclined to stand up to China if the United States had been there at the WHO hustling and saying, how could you be complimenting these people? How could you be buying their line about no, animal to human transmission, or no human to human transmission? No, this is wrong. So I just think that the performance of these institutions and the future of these institutions is going to turn on not only the major powers, but first and foremost, the strongest powers within those entities and what they want to make of those entities, whether they want to obstruct and block like China did in the face of a pandemic in the early weeks, whether they want to pull funding like the United States did at the height of a global pandemic, or whether they want to start doing what some of the middle powers have done, which is to unite and see if the reasonable middle can come together and kind of break the tie between these two superpowers that right now are so at each other's throats that they're not really supporting these organizations being in any way, the best versions of themselves at the height of a crisis. And the middle power role, which is not one we've really seen as much in history, at least in a consistent way, I think is there. You can feel Justin Trudeau and Angela Merkel and President Macron and New Zealand and even non-state actors, that don't have seats at the United Nations, like Taiwan, the Republic of Korea, Australia. You can see these countries now, after 3.5 years of, Trump or Obama to Trump whiplash of just, wait, how do we go from this to this? Now beginning to exercise agency and say, there's no one here but us countries, let's see what we can do to make these institutions work. So that's another part of the future story, is can there be a coalition of middle powers who actually push these organizations to be better versions of themselves?
You called out a few different countries there that are doing particularly well in their response to COVID. Are there others that you'd add to that list? Are there others we should be looking at?
I am dazzled, and I don't use that word lightly, by the Taiwanese response. And I don't say that as a provocation. I say it because I have not seen a country, that has combined the civil society kind of people-powered, bottom-up creativity with the sort of digital savvy, with the lesson learning from past pandemics, particularly SARS and MERS. And so some examples, even now in the kind of economic stimulus phase, and I'm no expert on Taiwan, there'd be people in Australia far more versed in this than me, but the desire now, after lockdown and the economic toll of the global shutdown, there's a desire to support small businesses and independent businesses, and not just have this be a pandemic that benefits, those enormous companies that can withstand the kind of blow that this has constituted. There's a desire to see not only e-commerce, which has profited immensely, at least in terms of the biggies like Amazon, because of this crisis, but the bricks and mortar, like mom and pop shop down the street. And so one of the things Taiwan has done is you can, with your ATM, you can basically take out money and get, I think, 2/3 of it back, as long as you don't use the money that you get from the stimulus on e-commerce. So it incentivizes use of your money at the independent bookstore or at the local restaurant, instead of the just doing everything electronically. And it pulls people, of course, out of the house back into the workplace. And that's going to have a big effect over time, if it works, on jobs. Then in terms of technology, I gather, and I say this as one who, for weeks here, we were trying to get COVID tests, and it was just impossible, even having sick loved ones. You had to have actually been to Wuhan, been to Milan, in order to be able to get a test, or have known personal contact with somebody who had. So, it's just very, very different in Taiwan. The testing, of course, right out the gate. On the masks, you have an app on your phone where, if you've run low on masks, you could actually look and see where the local pharmacies are. They actually keeps the stockpiles on the phone, so you can sort of know where to go, who's low on masks, who's high on masks. And again, that's kind of crowdsourcing. And finally, on misinformation, Taiwan, of course, has been dealing with China's misinformation for years. So they didn't believe a word that came out of the Chinese Communist Party in December on this outbreak, shut their borders, almost immediately, and have now crowdsourced civil society-based fact-checking mechanisms, but where the civil society folks and the social media company officials and ministry people are working in lockstep with one another in virtual teams to try to ensure that misinformation, whether on disease or on other issues, because of course in politics this is an equally big issue, but those teams working together in order to neutralize planted misinformation, which in Taiwan is often planted by the Chinese government or trolls working for the Chinese government, but could be coming from everywhere. And I just think there's so much that we can learn from how a country like Taiwan that has the record that it has established now on COVID. And it's an irony that we haven't yet been able to secure them observer status in the World Health Assembly.
If we can do that, if we can combat misinformation so well in Taiwan on a public health issue, can we do that in the United States when it comes to elections and fake news and misinformation being bombed from Russia or China or whoever?
I mean, on this front, I guess I would offer bad news and good news. And I mean, the bad news is just the social media behemoths, like these empires that leave in the dust all of the media giants that the United States has had in the past, the CBSs and the NBCs and the CNNs and even the Foxes. I mean, I teach at the Kennedy School, Harvard's Kennedy School and Harvard Law School. And I used to teach American foreign policy and human rights. And then it was clear I had to, that if I was interested in human rights, that many more countries are impacting human rights for good or bad than the United States. And so, I was talking about China and the EU and the African Union and middle powers and all the rest. And I realized, what the hell am I doing? I need to have, multiple units on social media companies and their impact on human rights. And so I had a research assistant of mine develop a slide that was all the flags of the various countries of the UN and their net worth, or like their economic worth, their, you could do it in terms of GDP or growth or, but basically finding it as much of an apples to apples comparison as I could between a company's worth and a country's economic output. And Facebook's flag was ahead of 167 of the 193 countries in the UN in terms of its worth. So we all know it has more adherents, as it were, than Christianity. But the power of this company and the failure, of people within it to get ahead of the curve at any juncture, the only times you see policy changes, and sometimes the policy changes like what is the actual policy, but sometimes it's about, are we applying the policy that we claimed we were applying? But the only time you really see those changes is when there's been some big disclosures. Some journalist has dug something up. Nothing was proactively volunteered, by, let's say, Facebook, or related a kind of consumer boycott movement of the kind that we've just seen in the United States by major companies like Verizon, Patagonia, Ben & Jerry's ice cream, REI, Coca-Cola, all of them saying we're not going to buy ads on Facebook because they are not policing incitement to violence sufficiently on their platform. And we're out. And what happens a week later? Facebook has changed its position and now is willing to begin considering labeling what can be taken certainly as incitement by the President of the United States, having before taken the position that no, because it's the president's newsworthy and therefore we're not going to label or take other measures as it relates to these kinds of moves. So financial pressure has made a difference, and the threat of regulation has made a difference. So that's the bad news, is that there's not this kind of organic, I don't know what's happening in Taiwan because I'm not there, but just what feels like a more of a kind of all hands on deck, how do we preserve our democracy that we work so hard to build kind of spirit. I don't want to romanticize it, but that it feels like it has more of that tenor. Here it's more adversarial, and then you eke out some kind of small concession. It's never quite enough. So the same week, Facebook made this announcement, which constituted some progress in response to the boycott. It announced that it would not be labeling or fact-checking climate denial posts on the Facebook platform. So it has deemed climate disinformation and climate denial something that is the equivalent of opinion, and therefore, can go as viral as it wants to without any label. It's ineligible for fact-checking. Now, it would be bad enough if one reached that judgment on the merits, because on COVID, they're not taking that kind of position. And on vaccinations, which is a major issue here in the United States, they're not taking that position, thankfully. And because of the nexus between climate change and health, very, very significant health metrics of a number of kinds, they could easily have put this under the rubric of health and made a different call. But it was a fossil fuel lobby, it appears, that prevailed on Facebook, again, to render climate science ineligible for fact checking. So that's the bad news. The good news is I've just offered a bunch of examples about corporate and citizen activism that has produced real results. And for the first time, you really do hear in Washington, I don't want to call it a sophisticated conversation. I mean, these are really tricky issues for Facebook as well, as to where to draw the various lines without impeding freedom of speech. But the kind of regulatory footstep effect, particularly conversations like that Elizabeth Warren and others have generated about potentially breaking up Facebook. I'm not sure where that's going to go, but those kinds of moves have made Facebook more alert to the kind of public and reputational costs that they are bearing. But I just wish that the health of our democracy, you asked the question about the prevention of foreign interference, that all of that was just intrinsically, the kind of paramount driving ethos, but it does seem to be much more traditional kind of financial profit cost benefit.
On the foreign interference, we're facing in Australia at the moment here, we think it's an unprecedented investigation by our ASIO, our chief, I don't know how you describe it, it's sort of like the FBI and the CIA, but with domestic surveillance capabilities, investigating a Labor member of the New South Wales Upper House, who we think it's alleging has been co-opted, or one of the staff members has been co-opted by the Chinese government, which we think is the first of its kind in Australia. And so it's an incredibly topical issue here right now. And so I'm wondering, in the United States, you obviously lived through the Hillary Clinton-Donald Trump election that was heavily influenced by outside actors. Are you guys bracing for a similar intervention of sorts at the next election?
Well, let me say that one of the sort of misleading, kind of unwitting misleading pieces of fallout from Russia's interference in 2016 is that there's a widespread view in the United States and all around the world that Russia's interference is kind of electorally triggered. It's electorally amplified for sure. I mean, we'll see how much in the coming days, but Russia has been interfering every day that has passed, since the election of Donald Trump over Hillary Clinton in November 2016, and it does so and I'm interested if this is something that China is going to do as well, whether in Australia or here. But as far as I can understand it, from having, not being an expert, but from having studied this at some length, there just is a view in Moscow, and I would suspect on the basis of the word that so many Chinese officials want to see Donald Trump be reelected despite the US-China standoff on Trump's watch. I suspect this view is shared in Beijing, but I think it's just less clear-cut or less explicit, let's put it that way. But the view is that the more divided we are as a democracy, the United States, the better off they are. And they're right. And so the interference, which came in the form in October, November, and with the hacking, and then the publication of various emails that were damaging the Clinton campaign, but then the flood of information that was aimed at securing voter suppression to convince voters, and with a lot of information about voter preferences, so knowing just how to tailor a message for the individual Facebook user, to try to keep that person away from the polls, or to try to amplify the campaigns of Jill Stein, a third-party candidate, to pull that critical slight percentage away. Those same tools in the wake of the election have been used to amplify Black Lives Matter posts on Facebook, as well as Antifa posts, as well as white supremacy kind of neo-Nazi posts. Same thing when Justice Kavanaugh, very divisive appellate court judge, was up to become a Supreme Court justice. Russian-backed accounts all over the pro-Kavanaugh argument for why he belonged on the Supreme Court, and all over the anti-Kavanaugh women's rights, let a survivor of alleged sexual harassment, sexual assault in that case be heard. Just whatever our fault lines are, you have seen in the last 3 years Russian-backed accounts piling on and amplifying them. And you've seen with Donald Trump, the president of the United States with, I've lost track of how many followers he has on Twitter, I think 80 million or something. Often it's a Sputnik associated reporter who puts on their Twitter feed a conspiracy theory, whether about coronavirus or about China or about Biden or about race. And then that Trump, with his 80 plus million followers, takes that and retweets it and gets it, to many, many more eyeballs. And so that's been ongoing. Your question about what kind of surge do we expect? The biggest worry, I think we can expect a colossal misinformation surge, really tailored to Trump's own strategy, which is voter suppression. It's to keep the, those people who might be ambivalent, who might not believe that Joe Biden can bring anything different, to keep them away from the polls, to convince the misinformation. A lot of it is about where the voting actually occurs, where the polling places are, like actually just saying, at noon on election day on Tuesday, sorry, the polls have closed, they're out of ballots. Then the person stays home. In fact, the polls are still open if we'd be voting in person, which is a big if as well. I started to talk about some good news, and I only offered a little bit of good news in the discussion on Facebook, but it is noteworthy that both Twitter and Facebook here in this country have carved out a kind of health of the democracy, that they're, again, AWOL on 1,000 issues, including climate change, and until recently, what can look like incitement to violence. But on voter suppression, both in their overt policies are claiming that they're going to be policing those issues much more vigilantly. So then you get to a separate set of concerns, and I'll just wrap with this, which is that, it isn't just misinformation. That was the big, bright, shiny object in the 2016 election. It's the technical capacity that the Russian Federation and the Chinese government and other potentially non-state actors have to get into the voter registration rolls, into the voting tabulation record of how people have voted. And our systems are woefully exposed to digital interference with actual outcomes. We learned that in 2016. We knew this is all in the public record, that the Russian Federation was in a number of states' voter machinery, that's like forensically poking around. Not entirely clear to me, having left on January 20th, 2017, what the classified findings are in terms of just what Russia did while poking around in those systems. But if they were in 2016, their capabilities were much greater. And because Donald Trump has refused to sign an election security bill, and because so many states have bought into his argument that this is a fake news story, many states in the United States are unprepared for actual interference in the balloting itself. So I'm hoping that, first of all, that the margin of victory is going to make this less of an issue than it was in 2016, where the election was settled by 78,000 votes spread across 3 states. That's a tiny margin. Al Gore, George W. Bush, tiny margin in Florida, as you recall. John Kerry, George W. Bush, people forget, tiny margin, matter of several hundred votes in Ohio. So these narrow margins that we've had really create a lot of scope for mischief. And it's just, crazy that the Republican Senate has not taken up, I think it's now more than a dozen House election security bills, and that Trump has made it clear he doesn't want to touch any of them. But it's crazier still that states who have a lot of, because the federal government, has the ability to raise funds in order to help the states do these things and set standards. But this does live at the state level. And the one hope one can have is that the pride that, I know it's maybe sounds a little corny, but that election officials take kind of in the professional work that they do every election, and the decentralization of it, may be the only protection really, in the sense that it's just a lot of different systems with different rules. Some do have paper trails, some don't. And that may, sort of complicate the ability of outsiders, to meddle. But it's a very worrying. I mean, it's a really alarming situation. I will say that the Biden campaign team, from what I understand, is investing vast amounts in hiring lawyers and voter protection personnel and others, because it may be one of these situations where on the eve of the election you get polls that suggest it's going to go one way, and then it swings in ways that you could attribute to late breaking voters just deciding at the last minute to go, let's say, with Trump. But there could be a more nefarious thing that has gone on. So I mean, it's very, very alarming.
Stay with the optimism. Let's stay with the potentially a good scenario that Joe Biden manages to overcome these obstacles and these hurdles and get himself elected. What do you think a future Biden administration's foreign policy priorities would be? And very conscious that in any 4 or 8 year term, you only get through a certain number of proactive policies before events take over and you have to largely respond to the latest global pandemic or terror attack. What do you think Joe Biden and his foreign affairs team would be most focused on in those early days?
Well, sadly, and I lived a version of this with President Obama. We had this grand vision that we spent 2007, 2008, into 2008 at least, thinking through, and then the global financial crisis hit, and to sort of paraphrase the expression that one hears in so many couples, in so many relationships, one job. You have one job. So I'm saying that to my husband an awful lot these days. Just one job, but on one level, when your people are out of work and when your people are sick, like that is just first order cleaning up the wreckage that will exist in the wake of this pandemic. It's going to suck an enormous amount of oxygen out of the early days, and of course, especially given the deficit that Vice President Biden would inherit if he became president, a deficit, yes, born of large stimuli, I guess you'd say, or stimulus packages, successive packages. I hope there'll be another one, given how badly people are hurting economically. But there's that, but it's really the enormous tax cut that Trump put in place with the support of many of those Republicans who've been preaching against expanding the deficit for so many years, when it was Democrats who wanted to spend on infrastructure, on schools, or healthcare. So big deficit, huge economic needs, massive unemployment, possibly, depending on where we are in a vaccine, and where we are in immunity, but possibly still ebbs and flows and large numbers of sick people or fatalities caused by this pandemic. So first order, I think, Biden is very much of the view, born of his entire life in public service, that pretty much everything we want to do in foreign policy, whether on climate change or vis-a-vis China, we are going to be stronger and much, much more effective under 2 conditions. One, the strength of our democracy at home, which is in dire straits. And so, related to getting our own house in order on the pandemic and the economic fallout, is a larger just set of investments on a democracy that the pandemic has exposed as failing working people, failing people of color in many communities. The disparate impact of this pandemic is just laying bare what would have been anyway the domestic agenda of President Biden, but now has that urgency. So So our ability to lead at the UN or, in my old stomping grounds, I mean, when we are, a country that can attract because of the work that we're doing domestically, we're a much more potent international force. So that's one aspect then, and it's again easier said than done, but dealing with some of the the inequality and the sort of corrosion that has occurred within America over in recent decades, and some of that attributable to how globalization has taken hold, but some of it with other sources. But the second dimension, I think, of the Biden mindset, from what I know of him going forward, is that everything we want to do, whether on climate or on pandemics or on China or on the next incarnation of a terrorist group, or on also improving our economy, also requires alliances, and it requires restoring the fabric of a democratic coalition that is now, for the United States, not a nice to have. It's not like, oh, it's nice to have friends. It's a need to have, right? In light of China's rise, in light of the kinds of threats that exist out there, that to start with a foundation that is a coalition of democracies. And, in order for our close allies, whether in Australia or in the Republic of Korea or in Japan or the transatlantic relationship, Germany, France, even Great Britain, where Boris and Trump have a good relationship, but we've lost the British public, or Trump has lost the British public, and never mind the relationships that we had spent years building up in Latin America and Sub-Saharan Africa in the Obama years. We need to come together. And I think, Biden has proposed a summit of democracies in the early, first year and the early months of his presidency. I mean, that's good. That'll bring people together. We'll have a chance to lay out an agenda. But we have there's a list of functional collaborations that we need, to plot on. And I think some of that is happening, by the way, among middle powers, on misinformation, on cybersecurity, on climate. I mean, it's not like the world has stood still with the US retreating and offending. But I think thinking about all the policy priorities we have, to understand that, again, domestic strength and doing things in the safety and the comfort and the solidarity of a coalition, I think, getting the trust back, which is going to be very hard, digging out of the hole that Trump has dug for the United States. I think a lot of the work in the early months will be spent doing that.
Would you help him do that work? Would you serve in his administration in some capacity if asked?
My view is it's one of those, kind of not even once in a generation, but once in a lifetime, maybe once in a century kind of crises for the United States. So it'd be and I wrote in the Education My Idealist that the service I got to do for Obama is, the most meaningful work that I've done, despite having been incredibly fortunate as a journalist and activist doing other work that I found very meaningful, but nothing like public service. It was amazing. But honestly, I don't know a single sort of supporter of Biden who's thought 1 minute about November 4th, or even now it's getting pushed out because of mail-in ballots and Corona. And, we may not know for a week hence who's won. I don't know anybody really thinking about kind of what the configuration of the personnel or anything like that would look like, or who'd be the right fit for actually helping with the recovery. But I definitely think everybody's got at least that I talk to, has that spirit, that you don't often see in political campaigns, I could say, which is just like, all eye on the prize, which is November 3rd.
That's really, really strong to hear. As someone who went through the last election campaign, where we I think got a bit caught up with what might have happened if and when we won, having how many opinion polls all saying the same thing, and then being sort of bitterly disappointed on the night. That's good to hear.
Yeah, I mean, I hope I'm not alone, but my feeling is, I mean, imagine living here and having worked on the Iran nuclear deal or the Paris Climate Treaty, or, even if you think TPP might be done a little bit differently in the future, people or Cuba normalization, right? Or joining the Human Rights Council and trying to make it more effective. I mean, however big or small the issue, to have watched someone just shred American standing in this way. And I'm not saying that there aren't, strands of the Trump approach that actually, won't be embraced. Like, I'm actually not, I think that not the latest in, sort of demonization of China, or acting as though you can only be an enemy of China is ridiculous given U.S. interests. But I think a tougher posture on behalf of American workers. I think some of the things that Trump promised around corruption, tax. I mean, he didn't get into the specifics of tax evasion; that wouldn't be in his interest. But there's a way in which actually refining American foreign policy and articulating its objectives in terms that are more rooted in the welfare of Americans, not taking for granted that people will just see the connection between an agreement you're doing over an Iran nuclear deal and your own security, or particularly in the trade area or in the economic finance area, really seeing a more seamless relationship really between foreign policy and domestic economic policy, I think would be a healthy corrective to how the next administration moves forward.
I've got a question here from Daniel Hurst, who's a journalist with the Australian Guardian, and he's asked specifically on a few different things that we've sort of touched on. But let me read his question to draw you specifically on this one. You spoke last year about the tensions in the relationship between China and Australia, and the situation has only deteriorated since then. You've previously suggested that like-minded countries should unite in framing issues such as Hong Kong and larger principles that are specific to any allies and safety in numbers. Can you elaborate how countries like Australia should approach increasingly complicated relationships with China, and who should take the lead in coordinating that effort if it's not going to be Donald Trump in the United States?
Well, let me unfortunately say that one significant share of the question got lost to the distance between Australia and the United States somewhere. No, it's okay. I got the ultimate question, but some of the examples I can imagine what they were, but I wasn't able to hear because it broke up. But I guess, building on a point I suppose I made earlier, and actually the point that I made when I came to Australia in November, it's going to be a lot easier for Australia to take the kind of initiative that it took, for example, at the World Health Organization, and risk the kind of retaliation that it is now enduring if it is doing something like that as part of a coordinated multilateral democratic coalition. And I just think, okay, fine. I'm sure someone in Canberra was talking to someone in Washington, maybe it was even someone senior, but that's really, really different than just as a matter of muscle memory, respect, necessity, self-interest, enlightened self-interest, collective self-interest, where we are just recognizing the power in numbers. Because China is, a very, very powerful country, and it's proving itself not only a country of great economic leverage, but a country that has now moved into a phase of bullying and intimidation that is actually alienating many, many people, including in countries that have really benefited from Chinese investments. And there's a fair amount of buyer's remorse out there right now. I don't know how long it'll last. I don't know if China's wolf warrior diplomacy will last, or the kind of blunt instruments it is now applying in its foreign policy to try to get what it wants. I don't know if that's going to continue. I mean, they're definitely, for a country and a communist party that has been quite enamored with the idea of soft power, the sort of post-corona moves initially looked like they were going to go in that direction of mask diplomacy and like, let's send the supplies out and really help people in their hour of need. And maybe the vaccine announcement of, I think it was $2 billion to contribute to a global vaccine, which is so important. Maybe that's back in the soft power vein, but a lot of it is, you vote with us this way, or you do what we want, or else. It's not soft power. It's much more coercive, whether through, usually through economic coercion. So there's a moment, and that's why it's very important that we not waste a minute if and when Vice President Biden becomes president, but where the potency of a coalition of democracies that includes European Union countries in Sub-Saharan Africa that are eager to be part of something different. The United States, of course, Australia, Republic of Korea, Japan, Taiwan. There are a lot of very powerful economic actors who are looking to do things in concert. It doesn't mean that our interests are always perfectly aligned. It doesn't mean that there won't be points of departure. But there's a kind of prisoner's dilemma, right? Where if we're off each doing it ourselves, it's not going to be in the collective interest. So we want to minimize defections, present as united a front as we can. That's what the TPP, might have been in another age. We'll see what happens with negotiations in the economic sphere. But I really think that I feel a little bit repetitive in a way, just keeping coming back to this. But we have really lost sight sometimes of actually how potent we can look in response, how much economic leverage we have. Now, maybe that because nationalism has been stirred up so much in China, and because the sort of fear of the fragility inside China is such that no amount of criticism or accountability from the outside is going to be tolerated, no matter what the size of the bloc. But so we will see. But I think to be in a world of just trying to accommodate China, no matter how aggressive they become their border, that world wasn't working for us. That world is not going to work for us. It's been tried, and right now there's still a number of European countries that are on the fence. My own view is that somehow, and this will be part of Biden's first year, is how, figuring out how to build a relationship with China that is supple enough to allow for the kind of accountability on Hong Kong, on the Uyghurs, on trade, on currency, but that yet carves out much more space than the Trump administration has, despite its overtures toward China, about the kind of shared strategic priorities that we can continue to work on together. I lived this kind of walk and chew gum at the same time dynamic, mainly with Russia in New York, because China wasn't yet as assertiveness, even as recently as 2016. And it's very challenging, and it requires, kind of a lot of professionalism. And I'm not sure that the political space in the United States or in Australia is very friendly to that kind of complex relationship. But we don't have the option of walking away from negotiating with China and trying to work together with China on a select number of issues, but nor do we have the option of returning to a period of kind of just rolling with what the Chinese government was doing just because it was increasing its economic leverage.
I've got a few different people that have asked the same kind of question in the same way, but it's about which world leaders you especially respect and admire. Yeah, that's the easiest way to ask it.
Well, I'm originally Irish. I'm from Ireland, and I must say, in the context of the pandemic, those leaders who kind of showed up in a more humane way, who really sort of distinguished themselves not only because of their competent handling of the pandemic, which of course as an American I'm very envious of, but also just the sort of humanity that they brought. So until recently, the Taoiseach in Ireland, the Prime Minister of Ireland, taking up his duty as a physician and running shifts throughout the coronavirus, I had a lot of admiration for that. It's sort of modeling, what you'd like to see at a different, local level, at a senior level. I've already mentioned the Taiwanese example, but the president of Taiwan, another example, like New Zealand, a very strong female leadership, no nonsense, science-based, but also with humanity and a fair amount of color and innovation. That's with respect to the coronavirus. I think Pope Francis, as a leader more generally, has he sort of reclaimed the language of dignity, of human dignity, from the very beginning, washing the feet of the migrants well ahead of his time. I mean, really before that became as political an act as it would become, but then never ceasing to use his voice on behalf of the most vulnerable people among us, and really living. I don't know. In my lifetime, I can't think of a pope. I mean, even Pope John Paul, and in the time of communism, where he, of course, played a just an absolute pivotal role, but someone who's so, kind of just viscerally identified with migrants, with refugees, with the people who are now, invisible. I completely understand also, like, that survivors of sexual violence and abuse in the Catholic Church do not feel heard and seen in that way, and I'm just praying that he can rectify that in a hurry. But I just at a time when we have 80 million people displaced around the world, we had 57 million when I left office on January 20th, 2017. This problem is just getting worse every day, and political leaders are ducking their responsibilities here and there, as you know, and just, if every single country slams its doors, it's not just the individuals who just by a stroke of fortune ended up often in a war zone or being persecuted because of their religion or race, or economically deprived because of climate change, or whatever the cause of displacement is. But it's also just the knock-on destabilizing effects for each of our more developed countries. I mean, there's a strategic and a humanitarian reason to care a lot more than people are caring right now about those people left in the commons, you might say. And I'm thankful that the Pope at least is speaking to their fate.
I'm curious. Someone asked this, but asked not to be named. Earlier this year, your former colleague Ben Rhodes admitted that the Obama Foreign Affairs team used to watch old clips of Julia Gillard, the former Prime Minister of Australia's misogyny speech, when they were feeling particularly frustrated by Tony Abbott. Feel free not to answer, but this person, I think a lot of our viewers are going to be curious. Did you ever watch that speech? Did you ever indulge in that at moments of frustration with our former Prime Minister?
I think we all, every individual everywhere, shares a tendency, and I'll describe that tendency just by sharing an anecdote about my own time, which I write about in the Education of Ideals, but my own time at the Obama White House, where I was very self-conscious of having been a journalist and now finding myself in the executive branch and being in, I'm going to come to the speech in a second, but being in the Situation Room, but being new and not quite knowing my way around, not being all that effective yet, working on human rights, which is like being the skunk at the lawn party sometimes in the US government, and just feeling a little bit of an imposter feeling, but also feeling like people may not have trusted me because I've been a journalist, and they might have thought that there I was in the Situation Room, and I'm a copious note taker, and they thinking I'm taking notes to feed something to a journalist rather than taking notes so I can remember what the hell was said an hour later. And so I came home and I said to Cass, my husband, who I met on the Obama campaign, I said, Cass, do you think that people are thinking that I'm like a journalist masquerading as a U.S. official or as a policymaker? And he said, there's only one thing I know. And I said, what? And he said, nobody's thinking about you at all. He said, they're thinking about themselves. And that's especially true at the White House, but it's really actually a decent rule of life. So I did watch that speech. But I didn't watch it, I didn't hate watch it because I was thinking about Australian foreign policy. I watched it because it spoke to my own experience of being a woman in foreign policy and in national security, and just the subtle dismissive ways in which otherwise often quite progressive people can kind of put you down or put you in your place, or again try to evade what you are trying to put forward. So that's my answer. No, I didn't watch it in the context of You Go Girl in the Australian context. I watched it in the You Go Girl in terms of the universality, I guess, of female experience.
Sure. Look, we're almost out of time, but I did want to ask you about something that you've spoken a little bit about here, which is the polarization, and it's sort of one question in two parts, which is what can we do to stitch our society and our world back together, both at the political macro sort of level, but then also I'm really curious, what can we as individuals do other than, vote for decent candidates and vote for candidates who have a less myopic perspective? What can we do in our own private, personal lives and day-to-day activities?
I think, at the institutional level and political level, our circumstances here are different than those there. I think you have actually, I know you have widening polarization there as well, which was a very sad realization I had when I visited. But I do think your shortened electoral calendar, your cycle for campaigning and so forth, is something that we would benefit from immensely, because here in the United States, Donald Trump filed his election papers for re-election on January 20th, 2017. That's the earliest anybody's ever done it, because there's all these norms, but he doesn't care about the norms. We're in permanent political warfare. We're in a 4-year election campaign, basically, at the presidential level. And our members of Congress are re-upping every 2 years, so they're raising money the whole time. And so anyway, so that's an adjustment one could make, is to try to kind of quarantine the process a little bit better to create more scope, at least outside of that. I'm not sure, given money in politics in this country, which the Supreme Court has licensed, the kind of difference that the measure of impact, or the amount of impact that will make. But I think it's something, but it would require everybody agreeing, and it's a prisoner's dilemma again. I think that, again, a big issue we have here, I'm not sure you have it, I can't recall if you have it there, but we have this gerrymandering problem where the maps, if the Republican Party controls the legislature, they will draw maps to ensure that they will permanently control the legislature. So, kind of divide, if there's like a very, robust Democratic community, or an African American community, or to divide, to take that community of 40,000 people and put 5,000 here and 5,000 here and 5,000 here and 5,000 here, and Democrats were while controlling fewer state legislatures, sadly, were guilty of this as well. And the Supreme Court, unfortunately, has licensed this to continue in a decision within the last year, which is catastrophic. And so, these institutional fixes really matter. They really and truly matter. I think more pressure on social media related to its algorithm. It decided long ago that it would make more money if it made you a more extreme version of yourself. If it catered not only to your preferences, but to a more extreme version of yourself. And so it is a radicalizing, and I don't know what the verb is, but extremifying platform. So, but the pressure on social media has never been as intense as it is right now. And so I think there's work to be done there in terms of what people are getting exposed to. That at the individual level, which I'm sure applies everywhere, really is it's the hardest thing to do. It's to expose yourself, and if you're in a position of influence with others, to try to ensure others are exposed to contrary perspectives, to alternative perspectives. co-teach a class with my husband Cass. We're both Obama stalwarts and big Biden fans.
I should say, I should just interrupt there. You've mentioned him a couple of times. For some of our viewers might not know, your husband is the author of one of my favorite books, Nudge, and is a former, as you were saying, Obama administration staffer in a not particularly well-known, at least in Australian context, and yet hugely powerful Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs. So I just wanted to give our viewers that little bit of context about, you know, your own family life.
Indeed, and he's great, and you should have him as part of your institute. He's not a guy who likes traveling very much, so this is your golden opportunity to hear from Cass, should you so choose. But we co-teach a class called Making Change When Change is Hard, where we look at instances of legal, policy, political, sometimes movement change, sometimes top-down change. And we do a bunch of historical cases like the Clean Air Act in the US, criminal justice reform, which is finally getting some attention. But an example of, you know, what I sort of forced myself to do and believe that our largely progressive student body should do is we also study the history of the conservative movement. And, you know, the sense of exclusion and marginalization that conservatives actually continue to feel on American campuses, but certainly felt, you know, when William F. Buckley and others were creating the movement in the first place. And it's a revelation for students who just have now, you know, kind of taken their positions in whatever cause they are a part of, combating gun violence or contesting climate, trying to be part of a anti-climate change movement, or now on Black Lives Matter. And to find ways to force yourself to walk in the shoes of others. And again, if you're in a position, you know, again, where I feel very lucky to be in, of having young people who are still very open, you know, and haven't yet dug in a immovable way, I don't think. But to have them walk in those shoes, I mean, the same way I would love Trump supporters to walk in the shoes of a refugee, you know, who's come to this country and been given almost no money by the U.S. government and not spoken the language, and yet managed to, you know, own the local deli because of their, you know, their work ethic and their determination to take care of their families back home and whatever war zone they're from. You know, just it can't just cut in one direction. You know, we have to somehow. I think the arts are very helpful. The theater is helpful. You know, things that just require you to get outside of where you increasingly live in a more insular place. Easier said than done, though, and I'm not great at it myself, but a work in progress.
Look, thank you. We're actually over time now, but this has just been an absolutely riveting conversation. As I said at the beginning, your book is beautifully written. It's for anyone that hasn't read it, I really do urge you to get out there and read it. My wife never reads any of my book recommendations. I recommended this to her, and she read it cover to cover. She's actually tuned in to watch this interview. She didn't tune in to watch you know, the former Prime Minister of Australia, but when I told her that I was interviewing Samantha Power, she was on it in a flash. It's a fantastic book. This was a great chat, and thank you so very much for making time for us.
Thank you. It was a true pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you.